For most of recorded galactic history, humanity existed as a statistical footnote, a species tagged as industrious, emotionally volatile, technologically middling, and strategically conservative, a civilization that negotiated hard borders, avoided expansion wars, and invested heavily in diplomacy, trade corridors, and mutual defense treaties rather than conquest. And from the perspective of the greater galaxy, this behavior was interpreted not as restraint, but as limitation, because in a universe where power was measured by how loudly a species could threaten its neighbors or how quickly it could strip mine a star system, humans appeared almost quaint, an odd coalition of cultures that talked endlessly about rules, ethics, escalation thresholds, and shared consequences. So when the Galactic Concord compiled its annual Strategic Balance Report, Earth and its colonies were summarized in 3 bland paragraphs noting adequate shipyards, modular fleet doctrine, strong logistics, and an unusual preference for redundancy over specialization, which several senior analysts quietly mocked during closed sessions, one of them a tall, many-eyed Virex named Calthuan, who famously remarked that humanity fought wars the way elders played board games, cautiously, politely, and always assuming the other side would follow the same rules, and that assessment stuck, echoed through councils and academies until it became accepted truth, even among humans' allies, including the small, amphibious Talaran Compact that owed its independence to a human-brokered ceasefire decades earlier, but privately doubted whether Earth could truly defend them if pressed by a major power. And so the galaxy spun on in that comfortable assumption until the day humanity began to quietly pull back, not in panic or defeat, but in a coordinated withdrawal so subtle most observers miss it at first. Trade envoys were called for consultations. Joint patrols suspended under polite legal justifications. Research exchanges paused due to internal reviews, and human fleets that once maintained visible presence along shared borders faded into deeper space, not disappearing but repositioning, their transponder codes still broadcasting but their patrol patterns no longer predictable, which triggered mild concern in some quarters and smug commentary in others, especially among the Dravic hegemony. A hierarchical empire built on rigid dominance displays, whose ruling caste interpreted the human. Pullback is confirmation of weakness, a species retreating to lick its wounds after centuries of overextension, and the Dravic War Minister, a scarred veteran named Rulvek, formally proposed a pressure campaign, not an invasion, just enough force to test human resolve, seize a few peripheral systems, and demonstrate to the Concord that Dravic authority could not be questioned. And the proposal passed with minimal resistance because no one wanted to be seen defending humans who themselves were stepping away from the table. And so the first Dravic fleets crossed into what had been jointly monitored space, encountering no resistance at all, no protests, no urgent emergency sessions, only a brief, precisely worded human communique noting that existing treaties had clauses regarding unilateral military actions and that consequences would be addressed in accordance with long-standing contingency frameworks. A phrase so bland it was mocked openly on galactic news feeds, commentators laughing at the idea of humans threatening consequences while actively abandoning forward positions. But within human command structures, the mood was very different, because this was not improvisation or fear. It was the execution of plans written generations earlier, plans that assumed eventually someone would mistake restraint for incapacity. And Admiral Sarah Whitaker, commander of Strategic Reserve Fleet 7, reviewed the unfolding situation from a dimly lit operations center buried beneath a lunar Regulus shield, noting calmly that Phase 1 indicators had been met, diplomatic disengagement complete, adversary advance confirmed, Allied exposure assessed, and when a junior officer asked whether they should warn the Talaran Compact more directly, Whitaker shook her head and said the warnings had already been given decades ago, embedded in treaty language most species never bothered to truly understand. Because humans had learned early that shouting rarely worked, but paperwork always did. And as Dravic forces consolidated their gains, occupying resource hubs and imposing tribute demands, the galaxy watched for a human response that never seemed to come. No fleets rushing to the border, no fiery speeches, only silence punctuated by the formal dissolution of several long-standing accords, a legal maneuver that caused little immediate alarm but had profound implications, because those accords had limited not only where human forces could operate but how they could be used. Constraints humans had willingly accepted to reassure everyone else, and now one by one those self-imposed limits were being removed, a fact noticed far too late by Concord legal scholars scrambling through archives, while on the ground, or rather in space, the Dravik pushed forward unexpectedly as their logistics networks began to fail in strange, non-violent ways, navigation buoys drifting off calibration, hyperspace lanes becoming statistically unstable, supply convoys arriving days late or not at all, engineers blaming cosmic variance until patterns emerged that suggested deliberate interference, though no hostile signatures were detected, no weapons fire, no cyber intrusion recognizable by known standards, just entropy accelerating around Dravik operations while human territory remained unaffected, and this unsettled even confident commanders like Rule Vec, who demanded explanations from intelligence officers that could offer only uncertainty, insisting there was no evidence of human action, which was technically true in the narrow sense that no laws of war had been violated because no war had been declared, and this ambiguity was precisely the point, as humanity's approach to conflict had always been less about spectacle and more about shaping the environment until opponents exhausted themselves, a philosophy born from centuries of internal conflict where outright victory often destroyed everything worth winning. And so while the galaxy debated whether humans had lost their nerve, Earth-activated deep systems few outsiders even knew existed, ancient infrastructure hidden within civilian networks, research platforms disguised as climate observatories, logistics algorithms that could reroute entire interstellar economies with minor parameter shifts, and at the heart of it all a doctrine known internally as strategic patience, which assumed humans would lose early battles, territory, reputation, and even allies, if necessary, to avoid the one thing they feared more than defeat, uncontrolled escalation. Because once escalation passed a certain threshold, humanity knew from bitter experience that it rarely stopped cleanly, and as weeks turned into months the pressure mounted, smaller powers watching closely, wondering if they should distance themselves from Earth or double down on alliances, and among them the Talaran leadership grew increasingly desperate, sending quiet messages asking whether the rumors were true, whether humans were really doing nothing, and the reply they received from Ambassador Daniel Reyes was characteristically human in its understatement, stating only that humanity was doing exactly what it had always promised to do, ensuring that no species would ever regret forcing humans to stop holding back, a phrase that chilled the Talaran Council despite its lack of overt threat, because they remembered old human stories, half-joking anecdotes about wars where humans lost millions, and still considered the outcome a draw, about contingency plans that spanned centuries, and as a Dravik, hegemony prepared to escalate further, approving limited orbital strikes to cow resistant populations. The first unmistakable sign arrived not as an explosion or fleet engagement, but as a broadcast, a galaxy-wide transmission carried on emergency channels, delivered in dozens of languages simultaneously, featuring a simple human face, older, calm, eyes steady, introducing himself as Elias Morano, Secretary of Defense for the United Earth Directorate, who stated without drama that humanity acknowledged the current situation, that previous assumptions regarding mutual restraint were now invalid, and that effective immediately, humanity would be transitioning from cooperative security posture to autonomous strategic enforcement. And then he added a line that would later be replayed in horror across 1,000 worlds, saying that this transition did not represent an increase in human aggression, only a return to baseline capability, because everything the galaxy had seen so far had been humanity operating far below its comfort zone, and as the transmission ended, deep within Dravik-controlled space, stars began to flicker, not go dark, not yet, but fluctuate in ways astrophysics could not easily explain, marking the moment when the galaxy, too late, began to realize that humans had never been weak, only patient, and that patience had just run out. The immediate aftermath of Elias Morano's broadcast rippled through the galaxy in uneven waves, because while the words themselves were calm and almost bureaucratic, the implications were anything but, and across Concord space analysts replayed the message frame by frame, searching for hidden threats or coded ultimatums and finding none, which disturbed them more than any overt warning could have, as civilizations accustomed to dramatic saber-rattling struggled to process a declaration that framed escalation as a downgrade from humanity's preferred restraint. And within the Dravik hegemony the response was predictably defiant, War Minister Rule Vec dismissing the transmission as psychological maneuvering meant to mask strategic exhaustion, ordering his admirals to proceed with Phase Talon, a plan involving synchronized orbital intimidation strikes against 3 Talaran colony moons to demonstrate that Dravik authority could not be undermined by rhetoric. But even as those orders were issued, the hegemony's command networks began experiencing anomalies that defied traditional counterintelligence models, not jamming or intrusion, but subtle desynchronization, timestamps drifting by microseconds, then milliseconds, then seconds, just enough to disrupt coordinated actions without triggering failsafes, leading Dravik technicians to recalibrate obsessively while blaming one another for incompetence, unaware that human systems had long ago learned how to exploit the reliance of centralized empires on perfect synchronization, a lesson humanity had learned the hard way during its own early spacefaring wars when decentralized insurgents nearly collapsed planetary governments by attacking nothing but timing itself. And now those same principles were being applied on a galactic scale, quietly and relentlessly, while Inhuman Space Admiral Whitaker oversaw the expansion of the engagement envelope with methodical precision, authorizing the activation of Reserve Fleets 1 through 9, units that had not conducted visible maneuvers in decades and whose existence was often dismissed by foreign observers as political fiction designed to inflate human strength on paper. Fleets composed not of massive dreadnoughts but of modular task groups capable of rapid reconfiguration, their true strength lying not in raw firepower but in adaptability, redundancy, and a command philosophy that empowered captains to act independently within broad strategic intent, making them infuriatingly difficult to predict or counter. And as these fleets dispersed through pre-calculated corridors, they did so without fanfare, no grand mobilization broadcasts, no martial speeches, only routine shipping notices and maintenance alerts filed through civilian registries, because humans understood that visibility was a choice, not a necessity, and they chose invisibility until results spoke for themselves, which they soon did when the first Dravik intimidation strike failed, not because of human interception, but because the Dravik fleet never arrived on schedule, their hyperspace exit vectors collapsing into turbulent eddies that spat ships out light hours off target, some colliding with one another, others emerging inside gravity wells that tore them apart, losses officially attributed to navigational error but privately terrifying to Dravik leadership, who prided themselves on absolute control and began to suspect sabotage despite lacking evidence, and this uncertainty spread beyond the hegemony as independent traders reported increasingly strange conditions along major lanes, entire routes becoming unreliable overnight while alternative paths through human-adjacent space remained oddly stable, prompting accusations that humanity was manipulating space-time itself, a charge human physicists quietly laughed at while acknowledging that the truth was both simpler and more unsettling. Involving long-term investments in infrastructure influence, gravitational mapping, and probabilistic modeling that allowed human systems to subtly bias outcomes over time, a capability developed originally to protect fragile early colonies from cosmic hazards and now repurposed to shape strategic realities without firing a shot. And as these effects compounded, the Dravik economy began to strain, tribute shipments delayed, industrial inputs misallocated, morale eroding among client species who noticed that Dravik protection no longer guaranteed stability, leading some to quietly reopen channels with Earth despite the risks, including the Talaran Compact, whose leadership finally received a second message from Ambassador Reyes, this one more direct, advising immediate evacuation of certain population centers and the suspension of all Dravik logistical cooperation, instructions the Talaran followed despite not fully understanding why, a decision that would soon save millions of lives. Because while humanity still refrained from overt violence, it had reached the point in its doctrine where demonstration became necessary, not to punish but to educate, and so Strategic Enforcement Directive Alpha was authorized, allowing limited kinetic action under tightly controlled parameters, resulting in the sudden and complete neutralization of a single Dravik forward base, not destroyed but rendered inert in under 3 minutes as its power system shut down, weapons safeties locked, life support stabilized at minimal levels, and command crews found themselves alive, unharmed, and utterly powerless, their emergency channels flooded with calm human instructions on how to surrender safely, an act that shocked the galaxy more than annihilation would have, because it revealed a level of precision and confidence that implied humans were choosing mercy not out of weakness but because they could afford it, and as footage of bewildered Dravik officers complying spread across networks, even Rulvek felt a flicker of doubt for the first time in his long career, a realization that the enemy he had dismissed was not reacting emotionally or impulsively but executing a plan whose contours he could not see, and that realization marked the true turning point. Because once the galaxy understood that humanity was not improvising but unveiling layers of capability long concealed by choice, alliances began to shift, votes delayed, councils recessed, and ancient warnings buried in Concord archives were finally re-examined, warnings written by species long extinct that spoke of a people who fought only when all other options were exhausted and who, when they did fight, redefined the rules of conflict itself. And as those warnings resurfaced, a chilling consensus began to form that humanity's greatest strength had never been its weapons or ships, but its willingness to endure being underestimated until the moment that underestimation became irreversible. As the galaxy reeled from the bloodless collapse of the Dravik forward base, the psychological impact spread faster than any fleet ever could, because for the first time in living memory a major power had been neutralized without spectacle, without a battle that could be reframed as heroic resistance, and without the comforting lie that defeat came only through overwhelming force, leaving Dravik citizens, client species, and rival empires alike struggling to explain how an installation guarded by layered defenses and veteran crews had simply stopped functioning while its captors politely requested surrender, and within the hegemony's inner councils panic began to bleed through rigid discipline as advisors argued over whether to escalate violently to reassert dominance or pull back to reassess, a debate that exposed a fatal flaw in Dravik culture, because their entire political identity rested on the belief that hesitation invited collapse, making retreat psychologically unbearable, even when logic demanded it, and so Rulvek, his authority already eroding, chose escalation, authorizing the long-dormant Red Talon Protocol which permitted unrestricted strikes against civilian-adjacent infrastructure to force rapid capitulation, a move that horrified even some of his own commanders, but one that aligned perfectly with humanity's expectations, because strategic patience assumed that adversaries who relied on fear would eventually overreach, and when the first Dravik bombardment struck a sparsely populated Talaran moon that humans had already helped evacuate, the reaction from Earth was immediate and utterly different in tone from anything before, not angry, not vengeful, but formal and final, as Elias Morano appeared again briefly to state that the conditions of maximum restraint no longer existed, and that humanity was now entering corrective action. A phrase so cold it sent ripples of dread through Concord chambers, because corrective action implied the removal of the problem rather than punishment, and within minutes of that declaration, systems across Dravik space experienced cascading failures far beyond logistics or navigation, entire command hierarchies finding their encrypted channels unreadable, data archives reverting to earlier states, automated defenses locking themselves into standby modes that could not be overridden locally, revealing that human influence had not been layered hastily during the conflict but embedded patiently over decades through trade, software, shared standards, and cooperative security updates that Dravik engineers had adopted without suspicion, trusting in their own perceived superiority, and now that trust had become a weapon turned inward, while human fleets that had remained shadows until now began to appear openly, not massed together but distributed everywhere that mattered, at shipyards, relay hubs, and energy nexuses, their arrival announced not by threats but by compliance notices informing local authorities that human forces were assuming temporary control to stabilize conditions, and the terrifying efficiency of it all lay in how reasonable it sounded, because nothing about the human advance resembled conquest. There were no declarations of annexation, no demands for tribute, only the systematic isolation of Dravik military assets and the quiet protection of civilian populations, a contrast that shattered the hegemony's propaganda overnight as client species realized humans were not coming to rule them, but to remove the entity that endangered them, leading several vassal states to openly declare neutrality or sever ties entirely, a domino effect that left Dravik leadership increasingly alone. And amid this unraveling, Rulvek ordered a final gamble, directing what remained of the core fleet toward Earth itself in a symbolic strike meant to restore fear and rally his people. A decision driven more by pride than strategy, because by the time the fleet assembled human sensors had already tracked every movement, every course correction, every whispered command, and rather than intercepting the fleet en route, humanity waited, allowing the armada to approach the outer defensive perimeter where centuries-old automated beacons flared to life, broadcasting a simple message in Dravik command code offering one last chance to disengage and return home safely. An offer Rulvek rejected publicly to preserve his image, sealing his fate and that of his fleet, because when the Armada crossed the line humanity had long defined internally as unacceptable, the response was overwhelming yet precise, space itself seeming to bend as human systems activated in concert, severing the fleet's cohesion, isolating ships into individual pockets where coordinated action became impossible, followed by targeted strikes that disabled propulsion and weapons without catastrophic hull breaches, leaving thousands of Dravik vessels drifting powerless, their crews alive and confronted with the undeniable truth that they were not facing a peer struggling to keep up, but a civilization that had engineered war as a controlled process rather than a chaotic gamble. And as surrender signals multiplied, the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the Dravik hegemony effectively ceased to function as a military power in the span of a single day, a collapse so complete and so restrained that historians would later struggle to categorize it, while within Earth's command centers, there was no celebration, only quiet acknowledgement that the line humanity had sworn never to cross lightly had been crossed, and that from this point forward the galaxy would no longer debate whether humans were dangerous, only how long they had been choosing not to be. In the wake of the Dravik fleet's neutralization, the galaxy entered a state best described as suspended disbelief, because wars were supposed to end with burning worlds or triumphant parades, not with tens of thousands of enemy ships drifting intact and compliant under the supervision of calm human task groups issuing instructions for power-down procedures and crew welfare. And this strange ending forced every major civilization to confront uncomfortable questions about its own assumptions, particularly the galactic Concord, whose authority had rested for centuries on the belief that it mediated between roughly comparable powers, a belief now shattered as delegates watched real-time feeds of Dravik admirals signing unconditional stand-down orders, while human officers treated them not as villains but as dangerous assets to be safely decommissioned. And within Concord chambers, long-suppressed archival warnings were finally brought into open session, records from extinct civilizations, describing encounters with early humanity that had ended not in defeat but in negotiated containment agreements, because even then humans had demonstrated a tendency to escalate conflict beyond the point others found survivable, a trait those ancient species had wisely chosen to manage rather than provoke. And as these revelations circulated, panic spread among powers that had quietly supported Dravik aggression, prompting emergency diplomatic missions to Earth where ambassadors arrived not to demand explanations, but to seek reassurance, a subtle but profound shift in tone that did not go unnoticed by human leadership, though they responded with the same measured professionalism that had characterized every step of the crisis, emphasizing that humanity had no interest in domination, only stability, and that stability required consequences for actions that endangered entire regions, a message underscored by the establishment of temporary human-administered security zones around former Dravik assets, zones explicitly framed as protective rather than punitive, yet enforced with a level of capability no one could now doubt, and within those zones human engineers worked alongside local populations to restore services disrupted by the hegemony's collapse, an act that earned wary gratitude and further eroded resistance to human presence. While deeper inside Dravik territory, the political consequences turned brutal as rival factions blamed one another for the catastrophe, leading to internal power struggles that humanity deliberately refused to influence directly, having learned from its own past that imposed outcomes rarely held, instead offering mediation only if requested unanimously by civilian representatives, a condition that forced Dravik society to confront its own fractures. And amid this turmoil, Vec himself was captured not in a dramatic assault, but during a routine transfer between secure locations when his escort systems failed simultaneously, leaving his command vessel dead in space and surrounded moments later by human ships whose crews addressed him by name and rank, informing him politely that he was being detained pending tribunal review under interstellar law, an interaction that reportedly broke the war minister more thoroughly than any battle, because for the first time he understood that humanity had known exactly who he was, where he would be, and what he would choose at every step, and had still given him multiple opportunities to stop. And as news of his capture spread, the remaining Dravik resistance collapsed almost overnight, replaced by desperate pleas for assistance and legitimacy, pleas the Concord hastily redirected toward Earth in tacit acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and in response humanity convened what it termed the Restoration Conference, inviting not only major powers but minor species, protectorates, and former vassals to participate as equals, a move that reshaped galactic politics more profoundly than any military victory could have, because it signaled that humanity's endgame was not supremacy but restructuring, a system where no single empire could again mistake silence for weakness. And as Admiral Whittaker observed the proceedings from afar, she reflected privately that this, not the battles never fought, was a real cause of no longer holding back. Because once the galaxy had seen what humans were capable of when pushed, there would be no returning to obscurity, Only the ongoing burden of proving that such power could coexist with restraint, a burden humanity accepted with grim clarity, knowing from its own long history that strength without responsibility destroyed everything it touched, and that the true test of their revealed power had only just begun. The Restoration Conference unfolded with an intensity unlike any prior galactic gathering because for the first time the agenda was not dominated by the loudest empires but shaped by those who had survived beneath them, and as representatives arrived on Lunar Station they did so under human security protocols that were firm yet scrupulously fair. A detailed notice immediately by seasoned diplomats who understood that procedure often revealed more about power than proclamations, and within the vast circular chamber humanity deliberately seated itself without elevated status, a symbolic choice that unsettled many attendees more than a throne would have, because it suggested confidence so complete it no longer required display. And throughout the early sessions human delegates listened far more than they spoke, allowing grievances to surface organically as minor species described decades of coerced treaties, resource siphoning, and strategic neglect under Concord oversight, testimonies that left several major powers visibly uncomfortable as patterns emerged implicating them not as villains but as beneficiaries of a system built on selective attention, and when Elias Morano finally addressed the assembly he did so not as a conqueror setting terms but as an administrator outlining constraints, stating plainly that humanity would not replace the Concord, would not accept permanent enforcement authority, and would not guarantee protection to any government unwilling to reform its internal abuses, a stance that surprised those who had assumed humans would leverage their demonstrated superiority into lasting control, and this refusal was perhaps the most destabilizing revelation of all, because it forced the galaxy to confront a future without a single dominant enforcer, requiring collective responsibility rather than delegated fear. And as debates intensified, evidence was presented of Dravic economic manipulation, military intimidation, and information control evidence, curated with meticulous neutrality by human analysts who avoided emotional framing, allowing fact alone to dismantle the hegemony's narrative, while simultaneously human relief operations continued across former Dravic space, rebuilding infrastructure without branding or demands, a strategy that won trust faster than any propaganda campaign could have. And within Dravic society the impact was seismic as civilians experienced for the first time a security presence that did not extract loyalty as payment, leading to grassroots council forming independently of the old caste system, councils that cautiously reached out to human mediators seeking guidance rather than orders, and humanity responded by providing procedural frameworks rather than directives, sharing lessons learned from its own turbulent history of revolutions and reforms, emphasizing mistakes as much as successes, a candor that resonated deeply with populations accustomed to rigid mythologies. And amid these changes, Rule-Vex Tribunal began quietly, conducted under interstellar law with observers from multiple species. The proceedings, notable not for spectacle but for restraint as evidence, was presented methodically, detailing decisions, consequences, and ignored warnings, leaving little room for dramatics, and when Vex attempted to justify his actions by citing deterrence doctrine and cultural necessity, a human legal advisor responded simply that cultural context explained behavior but did not excuse outcomes, a phrase that would later become a cornerstone of revised Concord statutes. And as weeks passed, the galaxy began to stabilize under a new, uneasy equilibrium where human fleets gradually reduced their visible presence without fully withdrawing, maintaining a watchful distance that reassured some and unnerved others, but everyone understood the message, that humanity would not rule but would also not disappear again into comforting underestimation. And Admiral Whitaker, overseeing the drawdown, noted subtle shifts in communication patterns. Fewer threats issued casually, more negotiations initiated quietly, a slow cultural change driven not by fear alone, but by the realization that unchecked aggression now carried predictable, enforceable consequences. And as the Restoration Conference concluded with the signing of the Framework Accords, a document emphasizing transparency, distributed security, and mutual accountability, there was no applause, only a subdued acceptance that the galaxy had crossed a threshold from which it could not retreat, because humanity had shown not just how to win without annihilation, but how to step back from victory without losing authority, a balance few civilizations had ever managed. And as Earth's representatives departed Lunar Station, Morano remarked privately that the hardest part was still ahead, not restraining others, but ensuring that humanity itself remembered why it had held back for so long, because power revealed could never be unseen, only relearned to be carried carefully. In the months following the framework accords, the galaxy entered what scholars would later call the era of measured silence, a period defined not by peace in the traditional sense but by a recalibration of intent, because while conflicts did not vanish, they changed character, becoming smaller, faster resolve, and far more cautious. As if every commander and council now carried an unspoken awareness of a boundary humanity had drawn without dramatics yet defended with absolute clarity, and this awareness seeped into doctrine, trade policy, and even cultural expression as once glorified epics of conquest fell out of favor, replaced by narratives emphasizing survival, balance, and the cost of hubris, a shift humanity observed with guarded optimism while continuing its deliberate disengagement from direct governance roles, dismantling temporary security zones and returning control to local authorities once minimum stability metrics were met, a process overseen by human auditors who insisted on transparent benchmarks rather than promises, frustrating some leaders accustomed to performative compliance but empowering civilian councils who now possess leverage rooted in measurable outcomes. And within former Dravic space, this approach produced uneven but undeniable progress as power redistributed away from the old caste system toward federated regional bodies, many of which adopted human-inspired redundancies and decentralization models not out of admiration but pragmatic recognition that systems designed to fail gracefully survived longer, a lesson learned painfully during the hegemony's collapse. And as these reforms unfolded, rule-vexed tribunal reached a conclusion, delivering a sentence focused less on retribution and more on accountability, stripping him of authority, restricting his movement permanently, and mandating that his testimony be preserved in full public record across Concord space, a decision that angered those who demanded harsher punishment, but proved more devastating in the long run, because it ensured future generations would study not a martyr or monster but a cautionary example of rationalized escalation. And as the galaxy absorbed these outcomes, humanity faced its own internal reckoning, debates flaring across Earth and its colonies over whether revealing so much capability had been a mistake, voices arguing that restraint had protected humanity from becoming a target, while others countered that invisibility had invited predation, a tension that played out in legislative chambers and public forums alike, forcing collective re-examination of identity that went beyond foreign policy into questions of purpose, responsibility, and legacy. And amid these debates, Admiral Whittaker prepared for retirement, her role complete, reflecting quietly that the success of strategic patience lay not in domination but in timing, knowing when to endure insult and when endurance itself became a liability, a nuance she feared might be lost as humanity's reputation shifted from underestimated to inevitable, and as she handed command to a new generation raised during the crisis rather than before it, she emphasized in her final briefing that the most dangerous mistake now would be to believe the myth others were constructing, the myth of an all-seeing, perfectly controlled human juggernaut, because such myths tempted complacency and justified fear-driven alliances, and she reminded them that humanity's advantage had never been perfection but adaptability, a trait that required humility to sustain. And as the galaxy continued its cautious adjustment to this new reality, subtle tests emerged, probing actions by fringe powers, covert arms build-ups, diplomatic brinkmanship framed as accidents, all carefully observed by human systems that responded proportionally, sometimes intervening, sometimes deliberately doing nothing to allow local resolution, reinforcing the principle that humanity was not the galaxy's parent or police, but its last line of defense against systemic collapse, a role no one had formally assigned but which circumstance had imposed. And as years passed without another major war, a strange phenomenon took hold, fear of humanity gradually giving way to a quieter respect rooted not in or but predictability. The knowledge that while humans could escalate beyond imagination, they preferred solutions that allowed everyone to keep living with themselves afterward, a preference that reshaped strategic planning across Concord space. And yet beneath the stability ran an undercurrent of unease, because everyone now understood that the restraint defining this era was a choice renewed daily, not a limitation imposed by weakness, and that knowledge lingered like gravity, invisible but inescapable, shaping every orbit, every decision, every silence. As the galaxy learned at last what it meant to coexist with a species that had never been harmless, only careful. The definitive end came not with a crisis, but with a choice, years after the Dravic collapse, when the galaxy had grown accustomed to the quiet pressure of human restraint shaping outcomes without headlines, because it was then that a coalition of mid-tier powers proposed a formal amendment to the framework accords that would grant humanity permanent emergency authority, a safety valve to be triggered whenever escalation threatened systemic collapse. an offer framed as trust but rooted in fear. And for the first time since revealing their baseline capability, humanity hesitated publicly, the debate unfolding in open session with human delegates acknowledging the practicality of the proposal while rejecting its premise, explaining that codifying humanity as a final arbiter would calcify dependence and eventually provoke resistance, recreating the very dynamics that had led to catastrophe. And after days of tense deliberation, Elias Morano delivered humanity's final position, stating that the galaxy had mistaken the lesson of the crisis, that the point was not that humans could intervene decisively, but that they had built systems to avoid needing to, and that permanent authority would erode those systems by encouraging others to abdicate responsibility, a refusal that stunned the assembly because it closed the door on empire forever, and instead humanity proposed a countermeasure. A distributed escalation lattice jointly maintained by all major powers, transparent by design, requiring collective consent thresholds that made unilateral domination mathematically impractical, a structure inspired by early human deterrence frameworks that had once kept their own world from annihilation, and while the lattice lacked the comforting simplicity of a single enforcer, it was adopted gradually as simulations demonstrated its resilience, marking the true end of humanity's singular role and the beginning of a shared one, and as the years rolled on the myths faded, replaced by institutional memory and procedural caution. Children across the galaxy growing up learning not legends of unstoppable humans, but case studies of patience, thresholds, and consequence. And on Earth, Admiral Whittaker's name became a footnote rather than a banner. Strategic patience taught quietly in academies as a philosophy rather than a weapon, because humanity understood that glory invited challenge while normalcy preserved peace. And in the end, that was a final revelation the galaxy had, being slowest to grasp, that humanity's greatest act of power was not the moment it stopped holding back, but the moment it chose, again and again, to hold back once more with eyes open, capability intact, and resolve unbroken, ensuring that the era ended not with humanity ruling the stars, but with the stars learning, finally, how to live without daring humanity to prove what it already had.